Welcome to Decoding the Creative, a show about the highs and lows of the creative experience and everything in between. In this episode, we explore the very feeling of creating itself. When we seek that feeling, what exactly are we looking for? What are our motivations? And how can we learn to understand ourselves better? And how do these motivations and desires vary among different individuals? We discuss all of that and more, and we share some of our not-so-guilty pleasures along the way. So without further ado, this is episode 4, Lost in the Feeling.
Here we are with episode 4, and today we'll be discussing the elusive feelings of creativity and the motivations that undergird this pursuit. But before this, we're going to do a segment called Not So Guilty Pleasures. After all, I am of the opinion that no enjoyment is really guilty. Nothing should be considered a guilty pleasure. You should unashamedly and unapologetically just enjoy things. So, Ben Evans, tell me some of your not-so-guilty pleasures.
All right, so I got a few. I have told a few people this, but a music interest of mine that I don't usually tell a lot of people is I am actually a big fan of Justin Bieber.
Nice.
There you go. It's out there into the world. Not like, and I will clarify, not like teenage Justin Bieber, because I was working at Target when he came out with that album when he the baby song, and I couldn't stand it. So
Right.
I couldn't stand that era of Bieber. Sorry to the believers out there. But I think it was his Purpose album and mainly everything that came after. So I guess grown up Justin Bieber and everything after. Honestly, it's solid stuff, and you can say what you want, but I feel like the material is really great. So I guess I am a believer from his adult years and on.
I love that. And that is truly a guilty pleasure, especially among musicians, because there is this gatekeeping that happens within musicians where if you want to be real, if you want to have cred in the musical world, there's some things you're supposed to like and there's some things you're supposed to hate. And I think that sucks, you know.
Oh,
And
heck yeah.
it's interesting, too, because with musicians like that, any pop musician who's been around for like a couple of decades at this point, they may have a good album and then 3 bad albums. So what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to hate all of them because you owe that to the musical community? I just don't buy that necessarily.
Nah, me either. I mean, you got to give credit where credit's due. And I mean, if you just simply don't like, pop music,
Right.
I completely understand why you wouldn't think any of his material is good. However, if you do have a open mind to pop music or,
Yeah.
even just the understanding of how honestly genius and creative some of the beats and underlying music behind his voice, and if you cut all his vocal stuff out, there's some really good stuff behind the music aspect of that album, especially the Purpose album. So I think that's what drew it to me, is mainly the music is just solid. So
Yeah. I'll give you one of mine here, not so guilty pleasure, and it's not a musician per se, but instead a platform, which is the app TikTok. Now,
Oh, snap.
I will say this much. TikTok, I think, for the non-user, a lot of people think it's just like preteens dancing and doing memes, and that is on there. But TikTok is a platform for sharing stuff just like anything else. So like on YouTube, there's a lot of great stuff and there's a lot of garbage. On TikTok, there's a lot of great stuff and there's a lot of garbage too. It's really just a question of what corridors and alleys you take on the platform. So if you interact with a lot of posts about music, you will get fed more stuff about music and it'll be a great experience, or any other subject. So TikTok is really representation of what you interact with and what you like, and there is a lot of quality content made by very creative people on there, but it gets maligned for silly gatekeeping reasons too. So I think TikTok is really misunderstood in that respect.
Yeah, I'd put TikTok, actually. It's funny you mentioned that, because that was definitely one of my guilty pleasures, because I agree with everything you said. It's actually kind of clever if you really delve into it. It's clever the way they've got it filtered, to really cater to what you're looking at and paying attention to, more so than I think other social media platforms have done. My girlfriend Shannon actually has TikTok, and it's really funny because I dog on TikTok all the time because I'm one of those, it's nothing but preteens up there dancing and being dumb. But she is constantly showing me actually really funny stuff on there
Oh, yeah.
that makes me come so close to actually getting into it myself. I think the only thing that's keeping me from it is just I just hate adding another social media
Yeah.
like app that I have to check every day. I don't know. I think that's really what's keeping me from it. But I will say it is a very clever app. I've underestimated it. I underestimated its popularity and its content because I found some stuff up there that she has showed me that absolutely has me in stitches as far
Yeah.
as being hilarious.
Yeah,
So,
it's the all-knowing algorithm of TikTok that kind of drives what you see and what you don't see. And whether or not we should be giving our attention to algorithms on the internet in general is another story, but it knows what it's doing.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, yeah, because it's really funny. I noticed that just seeing when she's looking through it, you can tell like she's not really getting all the stuff that I would be like, this is annoying, this is stupid. She really is. It's catering to what she's been paying attention
Yeah,
to.
exactly.
And our sense of humor is a lot alike in a lot of regards. So I see the stuff that she's looking at. I'm like, oh, this is actually not that bad because it's showing the stuff that she wants to see without having to go through all the fluff necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll as a bonus, I'll add another not so guilty pleasure that's related to this, and that would be the video game Fortnite. Now, I love Fortnite. My kids got me into playing it. I thought it was stupid at first, and then they started playing it more, and then I started playing it more, and then they stopped, and I just kept playing it. And people rag on it because is it past its prime? Probably. Is it for kids? Yes, kinda. But it is genuinely a lot of fun. I absolutely love it, and I'm not sorry for it. And, in the video game world, there's also a lot of gatekeeping that's like, this is real, and if you're the real deal, you should play this, and you shouldn't play that. And I'm like, now, how about this? I like it, and I'm going to enjoy it. And so it's the same spirit that people have about TikTok, is the same spirit people have about Fortnite, which is this weird superiority complex. I like them both, and I'm not sorry for it.
There you go, man. And I don't think you should feel sorry for it. If you like it and you enjoy it, go for it. I'm going to sound like the super old adult and say that I absolutely do not know what Fortnite is. I know that it's a game. I know it's super popular, but I couldn't tell you the first thing about Fortnite. So it probably is fun. I might like it, but I have just never gotten into it.
You,
So
you got to try it. All right, let me hear another one of your not so guilty pleasures.
Oh man, so another one that I don't really use, again, social media. I really try to limit how many of those things I have, but I do have Snapchat and I don't really use it more so past the fact that Shannon, my girlfriend, loves sending me um, videos of our dogs. So that's the main part of why I have it,
Yeah.
but I do find myself getting on the news part of it. And I don't know why I get sucked in for about 30 minutes to an hour some mornings learning about all these stupid like pop culture celebrities that I don't really know who they are, but for some reason I'm really fascinated with what's going on in their life and what
Yeah.
they just did. And it's never usually anything crazy. It's just like, and it's getting nuts in this generation because now, instead of being just movie stars and musicians or whatever the case, that we're used to, now it's like this YouTuber influencer just got caught drinking and driving while they were running away from the cops. And I'm like, a YouTuber? Like, this is news. Like, we're talking
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
someone who has YouTube video, because that's just where that realm has gotten up to as far as popularity and making money. But yeah, so I do find myself getting caught up in reading stories about celebrities that I legitimately have no idea who they are. I couldn't tell you who they are, but for some reason I really want to know why they are doing crazy stuff and making poor decisions.
Uh,
So
I love that. Yeah, at the end of the day, whether you are watching a TV show, reading a book, playing a video game, or following the news, a lot of times at the end of the day, you're just absorbing narratives from different angles. There's stories from different angles. We just are sponges that are just soaking up narratives from every direction all the time, and we love it. That's what we're all about.
yeah.
Also, interesting thing, I read a study a couple of years ago that showed that like primates, like gorillas, also have celebrities in their tribes, right? So if you would give a gorilla a photo of two other gorillas, one of them's the popular one and one's the not so popular one, they would always favor the popular one because celebrity isn't even a human concept, right? There are celebrities in animal worlds, right? So we're animals too. So like it's not a surprise to see that the idea of celebrity exists because it's not even it's not a human invention, which is crazy, right?
That is nuts, man. Jeez, learning something new every day. I had no idea that animals had celebrities as well within their communities.
It's crazy. I'll give you one more not so guilty pleasure of mine, and it's random and it's weird. And I'm going to go more and more specific as I go down this idea. But first of all, I do like soundtracks and like movie scores in general. I think
Yeah.
they're great to just listen to. Even go further down, I like video game soundtracks and like 8-bit chip tune soundtracks and stuff like that.
Okay.
And I really love that. I genuinely, unironically love it. Like when you first listen to it, if you queue up some like retro Nintendo soundtrack, at first it's funny. But then for me, I'm like, I actually like this, right? And then
And you
people,
find yourself listening to it like on the
yeah,
way to work.
I'm literally just jamming to this at work. And so people make that, and then people are also doing like chiptune or 8-bit covers of popular songs. They'll take like Red Hot Chili Peppers and make their songs into like a retro, it sounds like a retro Nintendo system is playing it. And I genuinely, unironically just love that. I even will like listen to soundtracks for games I haven't played. I don't even know them. So it's not even a nostalgia factor. I just genuinely like the way it sounds.
That's interesting because I've never really delved into that realm per se. Like I like soundtracks and I can
Yeah.
dig a really good soundtrack, but I've never noticed or paid attention to video game soundtracks and music
Yeah.
as you know, I hear it and I notice it, and if I hear a popular theme song, obviously I know what it is. But yeah, I've never really delved into that world, and it's crazy how, like you said, there's people that really are making music, and that's what it's for. Like
Yeah, that's
that's what it's
weird.
meant to sound like, and it's a really cool, really interesting world that I've never delved into.
I love it.
Yeah,
So the
man,
more
those were great.
Yeah, the moral of the story is don't feel guilty about the things you like. Just embrace them, embrace the weird, and just lean into it. So, on to the main point of today, which is the feeling of creativity itself. In part, we want to frame this in a way that makes sense to people outside of the arts, right? So, if
Hmm.
you're a musician or actor or writer, but if you're dating or married to someone who's not in the arts, how would you explain what it is that compels you? How do we describe this motivation? It's a peculiar thing, and it's something I think we should definitely explore.
Indeed, I do agree with that because throughout my years, it's been really interesting. I've encountered a lot of different conversations and a lot of different encounters where people have questioned why I'm doing what I'm doing, or they've
Right.
had false ideas of what it is that I get out of, being a musician, for example. And it's really interesting that a lot of people who aren't in that world or don't embrace that side of themselves per se as, creativity wise, it's really interesting how they just assume things and don't really know why we honestly do what we do. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
So it's a really cool concept because I've always explained it to people and they have just been honestly kind of jaw to the floor. Like, you do it for what? You don't make any money with this?
Nope.
Like, no, I actually owe money now. And they're like, what in the world are you doing? So it's always been interesting to talk about this.
Yeah, so I guess here's a way I'd like to frame it for you because I
Hmm.
believe that it's very likely that different people have different answers for this.
Hmm.
So, like for you, when you are being creative, what is it that you're actually seeking personally? What's your motivation and what's the feeling you're actually trying to achieve?
I think if you rewind, I think it was getting I think it was really latching on to that first time when I was playing drums. I was interested in it and I wanted to play it because I thought it was cool. I thought it was, a neat little thing that I could get into. But I think when I was going through, especially my teenage years, and you have all this teen angst and you're mad about things for no good reason.
Right.
I was playing drums and I was just out there pissed off about something. And I'm playing drums, and all of a sudden, I didn't know where I was at. I kind of just wasn't thinking about anything. I was lost in the music. I had my headphones on, listening to a tune, and I'm just playing along to the tune. And before you know it, I kind of snap back into reality, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
And nothing really bothered me, like it did before I went into that. So when I started playing drums and really grasping onto wanting to be a musician, a lot of it had to do with a sort of therapy aspect to it,
Right.
where I was really compelled to get lost in the feeling of playing drums for the sake of not wanting to think about whatever I was stressed out about that day, or angry about or annoyed about. And it really kind of gave me a reset. So I feel like my main foundational reason for creating in general has been one of therapy, if you will.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And there's a cathartic aspect to it. That's really what it is. And I do
Hmm.
think that people do it for different reasons. I think that if you polled 100 creative people, you grab some writers, some actors, some musicians, I think the answers are going to vary. And I think another variable we have to control for here is, are we talking about a social setting? Like, there's a really big difference between the feeling you may find behind a drum kit at a show and behind a
Hmm.
drum kit at your house or at a practice space. There is a difference between the socialized aspect and just being isolated and creating on your own. Like, that's a whole different thing, because the social aspect skews it. It's an
Hmm.
externality. It's another variable. You're getting like the oxytocin and the dopamine's running through your system and the crowd's clapping for you and stuff. That's different than just being alone and being lost in the feeling. That's a really big difference.
Oh, very true. Yeah, because with my fundamental foundational reason, the therapy I was telling you about, that really happens in the solitude moments. But with the social setting, like you said, now you're adding, the ego to it.
Yep.
I mean, let's be honest, every person in that social setting is being creative, they want to get praised for their work, and they want to get that lift in their ego.
Yeah, and I think that even in the social setting, whether it's a live show, whether it's any kind of group setting or performance, even that, I think people vary in terms of, like, some people are wanting affirmation, some people are wanting power, some people are wanting to be adored. I think there's a lot of psychology mixed up in that. People don't,
Hmm.
and I don't think people really know their motivations. For the most part, I think people don't examine their motivations and don't understand them. I think we are blind to our own motivations for the most part.
Hmm.
But it's interesting, going back to the therapeutic aspect. There is almost something like cleansing and purifying about the dissociative nature. It's kind of like, look, let's say you're playing drums for 30 minutes, or let's say you're writing a story for 45 minutes. The first 5 minutes, the first 10 minutes, you're cognizant of what you're doing, and then you like disconnect from reality, right? And your
Hmm.
mind goes to this other place, and really, it's just happening to you, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, the way I always describe it when I get into writing is, I'm laying down the train tracks while the train is moving.
Oh,
Like the
that's a good way to put
like the
it.
train is moving forward and I'm throwing the track down in front of me as it goes. So I don't even know what's happening. It's just words are happening, right?
Yeah.
And it's weird because I don't know about you, but for me, I do find that very, it's cathartic. It feels good, but it's also exhausting. It's almost like a cleansing, purifying feeling. And then when you're done, you must feel like you have poured something out of yourself and you are depleted in a certain way, which is a good thing, because in a lot
Yeah.
of our lives, we kind of feel like we don't do anything. If you have a desk job, you don't ever feel depleted, right?
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, you feel like you're just built up energy all the time, and you got to get it out.
right. So I think that when we're alone, I think a lot of people who create alone, whether they're writers or musicians or whatever, are seeking that cathartic, dissociative nature. And it feels right, or it feels illuminating, like you have realized something about yourself by getting into that zone, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good way of putting it. Because and with me, the disassociative nature is kind of what I really experience. It's a very out of body experience for me, and it's obviously that sounds insane to people who are non-creative. You're having an out of body experience. Like, what are you smoking while you're on playing drums? But in all seriousness, it really is, because it takes me out of what's physically going on, and I just really am into my mind focusing on making the beat that I'm making and what am I going to do next. And I'm constantly thinking about, will this sound good the next, with this next part. And I'm focused more on that and the creating and the piecing together of different aspects of the drum kit. That's what I'm focusing on, and that's the out of body experience that I feel. My brain is not focusing on anything else other than putting this piece to the puzzle here and this one here, and putting the whole thing together and creating something awesome that translate onto a drum kit. And then when I come back, like you said, there is that exhausting but satisfying feeling, because even though I haven't painted, a big masterpiece, watercolor painting or something you can visually see,
Right.
I heard every single thing that I played within that 30 minutes. And to me, that was a masterpiece that I created, and I didn't have to think about what was going on around me. And that's what made it perfect to me in that moment. But yeah, that's also why it made me exhausted, because I see, like, look what I just did.
Yeah, there's a value in just unbridled creation for creation's sake. Like, you could again translate it over into a non-musical setting. You could sit down and write a 5,000 word story in one sitting and then throw it away, and you got a cathartic value from it, even if no one ever reads it again and it gets taken to the
Mm-hmm.
trash dump. That's okay. There is an intrinsic value in just creating for your own wellness, for your own benefit. And I think that's part of what you see here, because you're right. When you're playing an instrument, unless you're recording it or writing down, if you're just improvising, it's all very ephemeral. It just disappears. Like, after you play it,
Mm-hmm.
it's gone, right?
Yeah,
And that's
especially if you don't record it or
yeah.
any sort of record of it.
So that's interesting, and I think a big part of this is really about what motivates you. What is your currency of exchange, right? Because I do think it varies among creative people. I think that some people are seeking a kind of glamour. I will say this much: I have seen that for some people there is this kind of, they're entertaining a fantasy of glamour, a fantasy of renown, where when they play, they imagine themselves in front of a crowd, and when they're with a crowd, they imagine themselves being worshipped or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. Like, adoration and affirmation and all of those things are an element in this. Even if you don't care about them, a lot of people do, and they're there regardless, right? So I think it's interesting to consider that you could take 10 different musicians and they all are coming to the table for kind of different reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to know that, because a lot of times they don't even know why. So how could they
Yeah.
tell you, and how can you discuss it when we haven't even kind of plumbed the depths of our own mind to understand it?
Yeah, and you bring up the ego part of it, and I think a nice trick that we all play on ourselves is we like to think that we don't have an ego at all, and I think just in reality, we all have an ego at play here with, when we create something and put it out into the world and in the social settings. I do feel like that part of creating, we have an ego going on, and we do want to be adored and praised for it. Some people obviously have different levels of that, but I do feel like we tend to try and trick ourselves and say that we don't have any sort of ego, when in all actuality, we do really like getting praise and, adoration for what we put out into the world creatively.
Yeah, that's true. And whether you even want it or not, it's still there anyway. Because I've
Mm-hmm.
seen, I've seen some collections of creative people. Like, if you see a band, you might see five people in a band, and you might be able to tell like one or two of them are like extreme introverts, and they don't even necessarily bask in the affirmation or bask in the ego aspect, but they're
Mm-hmm.
still they're still in the light anyway, right?
Yeah.
We all know like at least one person who is part of a creative project, and there's one of them that literally doesn't want the glamour. They literally do not want the spotlight. Now, some people tolerate it, and some people actively seek it out, but some people really don't want it. And I think that's interesting, because whether they want it or not, it's still there. And I do agree with you. Like, it's just a part of the human, it's part of the human psyche to want affirmation. And I think there's an interesting part to me, the way I've related it over as I get older. There's also an aspect of influence, knowing that you can transmit an idea or a feeling to other people. First of all, that feels like power, makes you feel like you are empowered, but you also are having an influence over other people's minds, over other people's thoughts and feelings, and that's really an incredible thing.
Yeah, that's a good point that I didn't even think about. Well, because that, to me, I've paid attention to that as well. When I realized that, okay, someone's not just praising me for, the fact that I played well tonight. They're praising me for the fact that a song that I was a part of really influenced, their mood that day, or the actions that they took into a certain situation. So
Yeah.
now you have this sense of, wow, I, created this event in someone else's life. It definitely gives you kind of a power trip in a certain sense, whether you act on it or not. It's happening, and that's a really crazy realization.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like, okay, the difference between affirmation and an influence to me is basically affirmation and validation basically say like me. Like if you are an affirmation type of person, and that's okay if you are, because I've heard musicians or I've heard like comedians say like I come up here because I like the affirmation, I like the applause, straight up,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
that affirmation says like me, whereas
Hmm.
influence says follow me. Like I want you to
Yeah.
believe what I believe, feel what I feel, use the words I use. And I have become more of that person over time where I want to see the transmission of ideas. Like if I play a show, I want to, when I hear you, I've played shows before where after the show ends, I hear people walking around and singing a chorus, that I wrote in my living room or something. And I know that I transmitted an idea. And that
Hmm.
transmission of an idea is really powerful to me. And sometimes it's not just an idea, but it can also just be a raw feeling, the feeling of a song, even if you can't really explain the lyrics mean. That transmission of influence is really different than just saying, like me, clap for me, right?
Yeah, yeah, very, very true, man. Those are great points to make with that.
I think that one thing that I've recognized, and I'm sure you can probably connect with this too, is when we seek that feeling, not everything scratches that itch equally. Like you can play a show and it doesn't scratch the itch, right?
Hmm.
And I've done that before, like where generally speaking, I get a certain kind of infusion of feeling and power and influence from doing live music events, but I've done some where I didn't get that. It felt hollow, it felt stale, and you play and then you walk away and you got nothing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's
Well,
that's a weird thing to try to figure out why. Why is that, right?
yeah, I think that's where you start going deeper into why we do it in social settings and what it does to us chemically, mentally, emotionally in those social settings.
Yeah.
And I feel like the difference with me is in the social settings, everything we've talked about, the adoration, the praise, even the chemical aspect of it, dopamine, all those chemical reactions that are going on in your brain, those all kind of come collectively together and create that social experience for me. So when I play a show or when I put a song out into the world, on a record or something like that, I enjoy that adoration for it. I look for people giving the positive reaction to it. In the aspect of playing a show, the lights and the energy from the crowd and the energy
Yeah.
from my bandmates, all of that is just very much translating. It's almost like a drug. It really
Yeah.
is. It's the closest thing that I can say you're doing drugs without actually doing drugs.
Right.
And I think, and socially for me, that's why I do it, because I'm addicted to that feeling of the energy from the crowd, the lights going off, just going to town on my kit, seeing my bandmates going crazy as well. And that's what drives me to do it socially. And like you said, you've played shows where you didn't really get that. And that's because I think in the social aspect, there's a lot of other factors at play, not just what you're doing. So I can go all in 100%, play my kit, play the songs perfect. But it doesn't matter if there's 10 people there or 100 people. If the people aren't into it or looking on their phones or not really caring, that's an aspect that's been taken away from the social setting that makes me achieve where I want to go with this. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
or, the sound system sucks. So the crowd might be super into it, but the sound system sucks. I can't hear myself. I can't hear my bandmates. The amp blew, technical difficulties. Okay, that's another aspect that if that gets taken away or doesn't line up the way it's supposed to, now my social experience, that drives my creativity, now it's just not there. And then, like you said, it doesn't feel, you don't get the same feeling like you do when it all clicks and comes together.
Yeah, and I agree. With what you just said, that really clarified it to me. You're right. There are so many elements and variables in a live experience that can skew it, right?
Hmm.
So, I think one of the most classic scenarios for any kind of live performer is an unengaged audience. So, for example, when musicians play at like a brewery or a bar, people are there just to hang out, and you're in the background, you're in the corner playing this. Whereas if you're playing a show, people are turned towards you, they're near the stage, they're looking at you, they're listening to you. And
Yeah.
so that engagement or lack of engagement really decides whether or not you felt like you connected with anybody or if you were just
Oh
there
yeah.
making noise, right?
Yep. Yep. And that's a big part of it to me. And it goes back into the adoration that and the ego that you don't want to admit that you have sometimes. But I
Yeah.
do want, the end of the day, I do want people to like the music that I play. And I want them to enjoy when I play a show. And when I get done playing, I want people, to come to the merch table and hang out and talk to us and, really, hey, I really dug your music tonight. And I've had those shows where it didn't work out. The crowd was not there. There might not have even been a crowd. And again, I could have killed it. We could have played so well that night, but
Yeah.
I walk out, just not feeling it and sometimes even questioning why am I doing this anymore? You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And I do think that it's so funny because you're right. There is an intoxication element. And
Hmm.
I have a whole lot of thoughts on that because I think that now more than ever, people are performing on the internet instead of performing in the real world for obvious reasons. And I feel like it's such a lesser intoxicant. It's like a weaker drink,
Yeah, yeah.
because it's just not the same. There is a monumental difference between playing a show and streaming a show over the internet, and that lesser intoxicant. It's just, man, you could unpack that for such a long time. But I think what we see here is that you have a motivation when you're alone. Like if you're alone behind your drum kit, you are looking to escape. You are trying.
Hmm.
There's a. I'm gonna escape reality. I'm gonna disconnect and kind of float off into the ether. And then, of course, there's a lot of things to be said about like why when you were a teenager, why did you want to escape? Now that's a whole different conversation.
Of course.
And I have the same conversation inside myself. And then, so when you're alone, there is one motivation, and it's escapism or whatever. And then when you're together in a social context at a show or any kind of group setting, there is the desire to not escape necessarily, but to connect and feel grounded in reality. So it's almost the opposite. It's not escaping; it's actually arriving, right?
Hmm.
And then
Yeah.
there's a motivation for that, and so it's almost like for a lot of people, there's probably two motivations, not just one, and that's a lot that you have to think about and look within yourself to find.
Exactly. And I think that's why, I like having this discussion because, like I said at the beginning, when I have this conversation or when I have people who are not necessarily, creative people ask me, why do you do this? Why, for instance, why do I get into a van with six other guys and go on the road, town to town? They go, oh, you get hotel rooms every night, right? And it's like, no, no, I
Nope.
don't. I sleep in the van with like six other people. And they're like, why do you do that? And that's, when we start delving into these topics right now, because on the surface, I think it's easy to think that, oh, people are being creative just because they want to be famous and make a bunch of money. That's their motivation. Or they just do this because, they think they're hopped up on drugs or something. And this is just what they do when they do drugs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really vague and shallow reasons that are out there for why creative people do what we do, in the eyes of non-creative people. So it's nice to have non-creative people necessarily, they come up to you and want to have these conversations with you because they want to kind of know what it is that drives you to want to keep doing what you're doing. So that's why I like having these conversations because there's a lot of different elements. We just scratched the surface. I feel like with this topic, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that you could talk to every creative person about and maybe get kind of different answers. Like, why did you start doing this? Because for most people, whatever craft they're into, painting, drawing, writing, doesn't matter. They first fell in love with it alone.
Hmm.
And then they found a different kind of intoxication when they started either sharing it with people or doing it in a live setting, whatever the case may be. When they went from solitude to social, that changes the entire dynamic. But they started out, there was a reason they started alone, right?
Yeah,
And I think
and
that's
I
important. I think it's
and I
important to look at, right?
and I think even too when you get to the level of sharing it out into the world, now you have different aspects that come in mentally and emotionally when you get different levels of success with your project. You share your book, you get a book deal,
Yeah.
and it makes it on a list to a certain extent. Okay, now I've got some recognition that I'm dealing with, but what happens the next time that you get it higher on your book list with your next
Yeah.
book? Now you got a whole different flood of emotions coming in every single level, of success, I guess you would say, that you reach.
Oh yeah, it's like an internalized competition where you're basically always hoping to jockey for something better than your last accomplishment, which is pretty tough because sometimes that's not reasonable. It's like, yeah, the greatest crowd you've ever played in front of, wouldn't you like to double that and do it twice over? Yes, but that may not necessarily be so easy to do. So that's why I think it's good for creative types to check their motivations and check their compulsions, because if you're carrying that baggage around inside of you that you're like, you have this baggage inside of you that like the glory days are behind me and I'll never do that again and I'll just never match up, like that's damaging to you inside. And so you really have to check yourself and make sure you're not like poisoning yourself with these expectations and these damaging ideas that you can investigate inside of
Yeah.
you, right?
Yeah, I feel like when you get to that point, I think it's natural for us to change our motivations for why we seek this quote unquote feeling that we're talking about. And, if you get into a motivation where you're like, oh, the past is behind me, my glory days they're gone. Well, now you haven't really let your motivations evolve with, time and you getting older and the circumstances around you changing. Now you need to start, well, what motivates me to want to continue writing or
Right.
take photography now? Like, because you still want to do it. You might not be as successful or recognized for it, but I mean, let's be real, you still want to do it.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
you're just not letting your motivations change with the circumstances around you. And if you do, now you can really flourish and continue to let your creativity exist in a healthy manner instead of creating a cloud of negativity per se.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the things, the connective tissue that I have recognized in all of my work and all of my various projects is one simple idea. And I want to share this because I think that I'm sure that you can probably connect with it. And I think not everyone, but a lot of creative folks will be able to connect with it, which is
Mm-hmm.
one idea. In life, what are you seeking? I think for me, I'm seeking transcendence, which is to feel larger than human, bigger than my circumstances, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
this permeates all things. So like when I'm alone, creating, writing, whatever, and you get into that dissociative zone, that's transcendence, right? Now, if you are in a crowd setting and you're singing for a crowd and they're singing the words you wrote and they're connecting with you and they find that resonance together with you, that's transcendence, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you escape from reality at all for a while in a creative thing, that's transcendence. And I think that's true. And that's true for me. And then it goes even further where it comes to like individual feelings are transcendent. So like dread and doom are transcendent. So that's like whether I'm listening to an emo song about a couple breaking up, or I'm watching a horror movie about people almost getting killed, or I'm reading a science fiction book about the end of the universe. All of those are kind of dreadful and centered around a certain kind of doom, and that too is transcendent.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like how angst, we have this angsty feeling that we like in music and we almost feel like we're celebrating it. And I think that's because it is more transcendent than the everyday. And I think to some extent that is what we seek when we seek that feeling, right?
Oh, yeah, I definitely agree. Transcendence, and I've never thought about it in those terms before, but to put a word on it, at the end of the day, I think that's what myself, and I can probably speak for a lot of other creative people, that's what we look for generally at the end of the day. But what makes it difficult is it's really hard to explain transcendence to people who, it's not something you can really explain, I guess, in
Yeah.
terms of like a definition or a word. You have to experience it.
Yep.
But one thing that was neat about transcendence, um, when I was talking about this episode with my girlfriend, and she was like, "What's the feeling?" And I was kind of explaining it, the out of body experience, the getting lost, in what I'm doing and not really thinking about the world. She really kind of opened up something to me that made me feel like I could connect with non-creative people in a better way when we talk about this in the future.
Yeah.
Is she was like, "Oh, well, that's kind of like." When I hang out and I'm around dogs, because she's a huge dog lover. And when this woman gets around dogs, nothing else matters. She just loves them. There's not a bad thing happening in the world, because that's what she's around and that's what she loves. And it made me realize that even though dogs are they're an animal, they're not a really, quote unquote creative thing.
Yeah.
This transcendence happens, I think, in all of us, just in different ways. With creative people, it comes in the form of our creative arts, but a way that I think we could connect with people in the future when we try to explain this to non-creative people is maybe find that thing that they're super interested in, whether it's, dogs or birds, or, maybe it's not an animal, maybe it's, they really love monuments or something, something, I don't know. But,
Yeah.
Find that thing and try and go, hey, the feeling I get when I create is the same feeling that you get when you interact with this thing that you're in love with.
Yeah.
You get
That's
lost and don't even pay attention to anything else around you.
Yeah, and I thought it was extremely timely that dogs started barking in the background when you said dogs. It was
It's
amazing.
it's basically like I planned it. I've had the dog in the closet this whole time, and I've been waiting to bring this up.
But no, you got a good point though, and I agree. And I think there's a delineation to be made when we say creative versus non-creative. Really, what we're talking about is creative in the fine arts, because you can be creative in a lot of things. My wife Hannah is great at. She's great at design. She's great at all things aesthetic, right? Whether it's home design, whether it's an outfit, whether it's paint colors, it doesn't matter. And those things are creative because you are creating a grand image, a grand, kind of tableau. However, really what we're talking about is helping people in the fine arts, which is music, art, dance, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
connect a common thread of thought to people that aren't in the fine arts, because a lot of people are creative in a lot of different ways. It's just a question of the arts tend to be this weird plateau where we think we're alien, but we're not, right? And you're right. We can find ways to help bridge the gap between people that are in the fine arts and people that are outside of it, so that there is not this alienation or competition aspect. Like, we can bridge that gap, right?
Of course.
And so I'll say this much, I always like to kind of end our main segment here with a bit of an affirmation towards creative folks. And it's also a bit of a challenge to myself and a challenge outward as well. And so today, my affirmation for this episode is this: creative folks, you can understand yourself, and finding clarity inside yourself will not invalidate or diminish your craft. It will empower you to act with intention and precision in your artistic pursuits and in the totality of your life.
There you go, man. Yours are always so much better than mine. They always sound so much more poetic and official. But that's great stuff, dude. Like, that's great stuff. My affirmation to creative people would just be, I would more so of a challenge. I would say maybe this week or whenever you listen to this episode, really think about the feeling that you have when you create. And maybe after you've listened to this episode, think about the different things we talked about, and maybe challenge yourself to talk to someone, whether it's a friend, a family member, a coworker, someone who's not necessarily invested in the fine arts or something creative like you are, and see if you can have a conversation about what it is that you do and what it is that motivates them, and see if you can challenge yourself to find a way to bridge your world with their world, and see the commonalities between the two, because you would probably be surprised that the feeling that you feel like you can't really explain to other people, you can actually explain a little bit better than you might think. So that's our show. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions, comments, complaints, or future show ideas at our email, decodingthecreative@gmail.com. And connect with us on Instagram at decodingthecreative, all one word, of course. Our logo design was made by Dana Gray Studios. Our intro music was recorded by my co-host Ray Hartsfield. And you can also check out my bands on Spotify, The Road to Milestone, which released a new album called Everything Ends, and my other band, Avery, who has an album out called Death of Us. Check them out, and we'll see you soon.